Hello, everyone. I am Mohammad Tawakkoli, the director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. I welcome you all to our bi-weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series, Iranian Women Poets, which I am co-convening with Professor Azita Taleghani and Professor Rivanne Sandler of the University of Toronto. Iranian Women Poets webinar series is partially supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This lecture series is a crucial component of our Iranian Women Poets digital compendia, which is initiated in close collaboration with the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation. At the outset, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their ancestral land. I'd like to welcome Professor Asghar Seyed Gohrab of Utrecht University to the University of Toronto. My colleague, Professor Rivanne Sandler, will be introducing our distinguished speaker and will moderate today's session on depicting the other Zhale Qa'em-Maqami and the function of poetry. Professor Sandler.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Tawakkoli, Mohammed, known as Mohammed. It's a pleasure to introduce you, and I sincerely hope that I have picked out points about you that you like yourself. There were many choices to be made, and I actually chose things that were interesting to me, so hopefully they're interesting to your esteemed audience. Professor Gohrab was born in Tehran and has lived in the Netherlands since 1986. He worked at Leiden University from 1997 to 2021. In September 2021, Professor Gohrab moved to Utrecht University to the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies as Professor of Iranian and Persian Studies. Professor Gohrab is presently the new chair of Iranian and Persian Studies at Utrecht University. As chair, he is responsible for the fields of Persian poetry as a living tradition, Islamic mysticism, and the history of Shiism and of the Persian-speaking parts of the Islamic world. Central to Professor Gohrab's research is the study of medieval Persian poetry, both secular and religious, and its reception in the modern world, examining how medieval poetry is utilized in modern Iranian politics, in popular culture, in visual representations, and in social media. In recent research, Professor Gohrab has examined the use of classical Persian poetry and medieval mystical and philosophical concepts in 3 central episodes in 20th century Iran. At the time of the Constitutional Revolution, I'll give dates, but people must know them, 1905 to 11, when poetry became a vehicle for introducing Western social and political ideas. During the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, when Ayatollah Khomeini used poetry to express his mystical ideals and mystical concepts to buttress his theory of Islamic government. And during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 88, when poetry became part of the state propaganda, supporting the cult of martyrdom, which became an icon of national identity. The most recent of his many publications, identified on his personal website, is 2021, Martyrdom, Mysticism, and Dissent, the Poetry of the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. Among his edited books is the 2019 publication, The Layered Heart, Essays on Persian Poetry, a celebration in honor of Dick Davis. As a second reference for his many publications, 214 Mirror of Dew, the Poetry of Alam Taj Zhale Qa'em-Maqami. I'm familiar with that and have used it as a teaching tool in my class, and it's very well used, and the students, and me included, admire this publication for bringing a passionate female and her poems to attention. There is much more, but I'm going to let you speak because it's not like you have 1,000 hours. And so, although Mohammed has already mentioned your title, I will just say it once again to introduce you to this event. Depicting the Others, Zhale Qa'em-Maqami, and the Function of Poetry. So thank you so much, and I let you take the, I don't think we can say floor, but let's say take the
air.
Take the screen, air.
Okay.
Badra begiram.
Take whatever helps you. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Dear Mohammed, thanks a lot for inviting me really for this prestigious, I should say, lecture series. And Rivanne, I really very grateful for your long and very friendly introduction. I think I never had such a long introduction, because usually when people start introducing me, I interrupt them, but I couldn't interrupt you through this screen. And but thank you, thanks a lot for. I'm humbled, really. So thanks a lot. So what I'm going to talk about for tonight is about Zhale Qa'em-Maqami. As Rivanne just mentioned, I translated her poetry, and her poetry actually, I was familiar to her poetry from the 90s, and I gathered and translated pieces of her poetry through actually 90s and later on from 2000. And finally, I decided, to translate the whole of it and publish it, because she is very unique. And I'm not working on Zhale actually the last 3-4 years. But when Mohammed asked me to come here and give a presentation, a paper on Zhale, I did not go back to my book because I just wanted, I had for myself a number of questions. Who is Zhale, and why? The central question that I would like to deal with it tonight, why did Zhale choose poetry to write about her experiences and not prose? What was it that she used it? So what I'm going to talk about in the first 11 slides, I will just go with you through the period that Zhale lived, a bit of her biography, and then I go to my paper. I will be reading my paper later on about the question I just posed about the, why poetry, and how did she how did poetry actually help her to depict the others without being too precise? That's actually the point I would like to make at the end of this presentation. So if we go to status of women in the medieval period and also in the recent 19th century, 18th century, we will see actually a number of female, eminent female figures in Iranian history, but there are not, at least not to my knowledge, we do not have a monograph. Sometimes if we search on internet, search the libraries, we can find an article or references or encyclopedic references. These are, for instance, Nurjahan Tehrani is one of them, but also I had to say that my dear colleague Dick Davis collected the A Mirror of My Heart here, the book, a huge number of Persian poets in which he not only translates actually their poetry, but also pays attention to how they depicted the world, how they depicted their own individual world in relation to men, their husbands, their fathers, their parents, and their environment. So status of women were not, at equal footing with men, and that's important that we know it. This is not something that I discovered, but this is what I'm trying to say is that Zhale broke this taboo by writing about her personal experiences, daily experiences in poetry. I will come back to this point. And also at that period, I've only here one slide, Lahuti, Abu Qasim Lahuti, Niqab Nang, for instance, many poets of this period of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, beginning 20th century, they wrote about various aspects of women's position, emancipation, as you know. Part of these poets, they wanted actually to remove hijab or remove the veil, but others, should also be said, others like Nasim Shuman, they actually wanted women to wear a veil and go to school without actually violating anything. But the point was here, always mention it in my lectures, that they did never ask women, what do you want? They always, there were men dictating women what they have to do, what is good for them, and what is good for Iran to be a modernized country. Which on itself is a very fruitful discussion, for later on. And here we see very, in a way, ferociously, Lahuti actually asks women to remove their veil. They remove their veil because he says in the second line, for instance, whenever people talk of your veil, the rival laughs while tears comes to my eyes. And rival here is actually the Europeans. He doesn't want to see Iranian women in veil, that the others, the modern Europeans, they make fun of Iranian women. So there are many of these poems in this period, and Zhale actually was writing more or less in the same period. Another poet a bit earlier is, for instance, Tahir Qurratul Ain, the poem which is attributed to her. Many of you know this. Ger be tu uftadam nazar, chehre be chehre, ro be ro, shahr dam qam tu ra, nukte be nukte, mu be mu. It's a beautiful poem, and it's also translated beautifully again by Dick Davis. But here in this poem, if we look at this poem, we do not see any traces of femalehood, of women. that you can say, okay, this is written by a woman. It could also be written by a man. And there are many of these poems through actually centuries in Persian history that is very hard actually, if you do not know it is written by a woman, to say, okay, this is a female poetry. And but Zhale changed this. That actually, if you put Zhale in the history of Persian literature, Persian poetry especially, we can see that Zhale changed this. Before going into this, a bit of biography. I don't know whether I have to mention this. I don't see you all, so I don't know whether you know about her life very shortly. She was the daughter of the very cultured Qa'em-Maqam Farahani family. Her mother was the famous, the daughter of the famous minister Mirza Abul Qasim Farahani, so she came from a very well-to-do family. She got a very good, nice experiences, memories of her childhood, but she was married to an older man in the 40s, while she was only 16 years old, so very young. And it was an arranged marriage, and the arranged marriage was because the family was in financial problems and they had to actually marry off Zhale. And about this, this is one of the poems that Zhale wrote. It was a very moving poem. I read just a few lines in Persian, and then we go forward. I'm not going to read all of it in Persian and English. So I'm now reading only Persian, and then you can follow me with the English translation for a few lines. This is actually a complaint against her parents, specifically her mother. چه میشد؟ چه میشد آخر این مادر اگر شوهر نمی کردم؟ گرفتار بلا خود را چه میشد گر نمی کردم؟ گر از بدبختیم افسانه خواندی داستان گویی، به بدبختی قسم کان قصه را باور نمی کردم. مگر باری گران بودیم و مشت استخوان ما پدر را پشت خم می کرد اگر شوهر نمی کردم. بر آن گسترده خوان گویی چه بودم؟ گربه‌ای کوچک که غیر از لقمه نان خواهشی دیگر نمی کردم. This is a beautiful poem, but this is actually an example of any poems that we see in Zhale is the femininity. There's a daughter talking to her mother, and this is very, very unique. And we know that Zhale wrote poetry because she followed school, as I just mentioned, traditional curriculum, Quran, Islamic traditions. I will come back to this again to be more specific. And she also refers to her period at school. So I went to school to read and write. I was less than 5 years old, no more. So in what I'm going also to read later on, this is my question, in how far can we take this at face value? Because all these, astrology, astronomy, philosophy, mantiq, rhetoric, how old was she and how long did she, go to school? But the point is that any line of poetry that she wrote visually is, you can immediately see it is a woman talking. And these poems, they were collected by her son, published at different periods, and her son is Peshman Bakhtiyari. And that's actually what I would just wanted to say very shortly about Zhale's life. And now I go to my writing about her poetry. Zhale is one of the first female Persian poets whose poetry expresses a female voice, very different from that of other poets such as Tahireh Qurratul Ain or other Persian medieval poets such as Jahan Malik Khatun. There is virtually not a single poem that would have the reader wondering whether the speaker was female or male or female. Of course, poetry should not be divided in categories such as male or female, as it is the text that matters most. Yet, in Zhale's case, this is important because her poetry is an example of the plight of women in Persia. She did not write poetry to be published. It is not a diary intended to record the events and experiences. A generation of Persian female poets composed poetry in this period to display their talents, exhibiting their cultural engagement and their education in an epoch in which female education was slowly becoming socially accepted. We certainly see in the poetry of female poets of this period how they refer to their personal conditions, but the majority of their poetry has not yet been published. So there are many of these examples, but they are not yet published. That's actually my point. And I hope that with this project that Muhammad is launching, we can pay more attention to these poets. This female voice is strengthened by subjects associated with women in Persian culture at the turn of the 20th century. Several of these topics were treated by her for the first time in Persian, such as the traditional Persian wedding table, the ideal husband, the unborn child, and reproaching one's husband. Another subject category is that of poems in which Zhale talks to an object such as a mirror, a Singer sewing machine, a comb, a curler, and a samovar. Perhaps the most forceful subjects Zhale covers are contained in poems in which she analyzes how people perceive the differences between men and women, referring to virtues such as chastity and continence, which are commonly expected from women and not men. For instance, she says of longing, this is this poem. I read the Persian. مرد اگر مجنون شود از شور عشق زن رواست. مرد اگر مجنون شود از شور عشق زن رواست، زان که مرد است و کارش برتر از چون و چراست. لیک اگر اندک هوایی در سر زن راه یافت، قتل او شرعاً همر جایز نشد، عرفاً رواست. بر برادر، بر پدر، بر شوست رجم او از آنک عشق دختر، عشق زن بر مرد نامحرم خطاست. So it is acceptable if a man goes mad out of desire born of love for a woman, because he is a man and his affairs are above why and how. However, if a slight lust finds its way into a woman's mind, even if killing her is not allowed under religious law, traditional law allows it. Her brother, father, and husband are expected to kill her by stoning. It is wrong when a girl or woman loves a strange man. In another poem, she states that men and women are created equal, but one is free the other is imprisoned in a sack. And this one, در دکان آفرینش، در دکان آفرینش جنس ما و اوست یکسان، عمر ما طی می شود در کیسه ای سربسته اما. So in the workshop of creation, men's and women's geniuses were the same, but we spent our lives in a sack with a closed opening. And this image of the sack in with a closed opening is taken from Nizami. Nizami's Lady of Majnun. Nizami uses this metaphor for Layli, who is imprisoned, incarcerated, as if she is in a sack and she cannot even breathe. And Zhale loves Nizami very much. So this is probably taken from Nizami and reworked. Perhaps the most ferocious attack against men is the following passage, in which she severely criticizes men who apparently cite the Quran to bolster their superiority to women. Here, Zhale interprets the verses of the Quran by emphasizing the equality between men and women. This is a long poem, but I have just a short part of it. Here she's a bit angry, actually. این کتاب آسمانی وین تو آخر شرم دار، این تو این آیین اسلام آنچه میگویی کجاست؟ کی خدا پروانه بیداد را توشیح کرد؟ کی پیامبر جنس زن را این چنین بیچاره خواست؟ گر محمد بود جنت را به زیر پای زن هشت و با این گفته مقداری ز جنس مرد کاست. گر پیامبر بود زن را هم تراز مرد گفت، وی بسا حقها که او را داد و اکنون زیر پاست. And it goes on, and then she refers to the Quran. خود طلاق ما به دست توست، اما آن طلاق گر ز دین داری خبر مردود ذات کبریاست. آیت مثنی ثلاث ار هست و خفتم ز پی، آیت لن تستطیعوا نیز فرمان خداست. چون تواند مرد عادل زیست با زنهای خویش، کین یکی زشت است و پیر آن یکی جوان و دلرباست. And then she goes on. So just a few points as we were reading. So she refers actually to the Quran and to the verses in which men are allowed or said to be allowed to take more than one wife, and she is actually very ferociously, very savagely trying to criticize this, and said men cannot maintain equality and fairness towards women. And then at the last verse, as you can see, go and cast your eyes on this decree so that you will know that this permission is subject to obeying an impossible command if you have sense and reason. And this is actually very candid. Anytime I come back again to this poem, I'm moved for the candid way she talks about all these sensitive topics, which might be, for me at least as a male, sensitive, but for women in this period and also later on is very existential. In addition, Zhale offers us a considerable number of poems in which she deals with various subjects ranging from politics, such as personal freedom, patriotism, equality between men and women, social themes such as love, forced marriage, and drug addiction. to very personal topics such as the relationship between parent and child, husband and wife, and personal reflections on her condition in a patriarchal society. Now we come referring to a number of aspects of her features of her poetry, and then I'll move to the last part, the essential part about why poetry and not prose. Zhale's poetry is reflective in the sense that she contemplates ethical issues, writing about the meaning of life, what happiness means, and how death could be defeated in man's life. While her poetry focuses on her thoughts and feelings in relation to close family members, one wonders why she couched these personal subjects in the form of poetry. Why not in prose, keeping a diary? The Persian literary historian Ghulam Hossein Yusufi surmises that she composed poetry to calm her vexed soul in isolation. He continues and says, when a young, beautiful, talented, poetic, artistic, and avid reader became the wife of an age-stricken husband who treated her as a mere adjunct of the house, it was evident in what situation she lived in. She lived in a corner of loneliness. And that's actually the loneliness is also a topic that a number of colleagues have compared Zhale to Emily Dickinson, for instance. We may never know why Zhale used poetry to convey her emotions, to elaborate on private matters such as her relationship with her parents and the husband imposed upon her, her pregnancy, miscarriage, and her opinions about other individuals. Her poetry is not autobiographical in the sense that she wanted to record the events, sometimes something that was very much current during the last years of the 19th century. If we look, for instance, at the Ruzname by Etemad Saltaneh, in which he offers a daily report of the events between the years 1875 to 1895. These are certainly verses which could be regarded as autobiographical information, but these are too brief compared to an elaborated autobiographical record. She refers concretely to the age at which she began her education, as we just saw. And she also states that she learned specific subjects, but we do not know at exactly what age, at what level, or whether she liked certain subjects more than others. All this information is given to emphasize that she is intellectually superior to her husband, that she is emotionally imprisoned, physically abused, and intellectually wasted. The biographical information gears towards a frustrated young woman fully cognizant of her sad future. If we want to impose the concept of autobiography on her poetry, we may refer to the depiction of real people with whom she has an interaction. In her characterization, she uses certain emotive words and metaphors that trigger a type of a person. To give an example, we can look at the depiction of her husband. This portrayal can be divided into physical appearance, emotional capacity, and intellectual aptitude. One example of each suffices here. The husband is depicted as an intellectually shallow and a nationalistic man who is against the Arabs and Alexander the Great, the two major invading forces in Persia. But the husband is also against contemporary powers, yet he loves the money he can earn from the Ottoman Turks. And here we see there's a long poem, but I have only a passage of it. He holds ancient Persia before his eyes as if it is still a large empire. He interprets world history through his own eyes. He is indeed a good interpreter. This is very ironically, of course, here. Alexander's and the Arabs' victories are just a myth, if not fantasy. He is an enemy of the Arab race, but he does not disapprove of Arab traditions. When he speaks, he is very pious. When it comes to practice, he is a peculiar infidel, enemy of the Russians and the English. He also hates European governments. He is hostile to the Ottomans, but a friend of the Ottoman layer. In his religion, the man with the long beard deserves to be insulted without limit. Zhale's poetry in the matter of husband's physical appearance, she compares him to a demon. There are many references, very negative descriptions of her husband. Her description is not specific. We do not know how tall he was or what his facial expressions were. Zhale refers several times to his beard and teeth. Why the beard is like a brushwood pricking her, the teeth are alluded to ironically, and this may be a reference to rotten teeth and the bad odor coming from his mouth. Here, when he puts his arm around my neck, when he puts his arm around my neck, it's as if I am carrying brushwood. Deep in the night, I have kisses on my lips from the good teeth in his mouth. In several poems, Zhale depicts the husband as a man with little empathy and emotional capacity. Perhaps the most eloquent reference is the following poem, in which she refers to their age difference and wishes her husband death. And this one is actually the same poem, is longer. Here, his daughters are older than I. Do not tell me my complaints are unfounded. I grant him my trousseau and the bride price, but I do have one demand of him, his death. Zhale's poetry, as I said, is reflective. It is as if each poem opens a window onto a specific moment of her intense experiences. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of her poetry is the way she triggers empathy by sharing a very private matter, such as her husband's nocturnal visits, and how he pricks with his beard, marital rape, and her candid emotional outbursts, all of which strongly appeal to the reader. Poetry lifts these experiences to the level of art, allowing the reader his or her own interpretations. This inclusion of the reader in her private female domain is entirely new in Persian poetic tradition. Persian poetry is rich in the genre of hasbihal, in which the poet allows a person or even a soulless object to speak directly to the reader. But Zhale's poems are different in offering an insight into the psychological depth of the conditions of a woman living in a transitional period of Persian history. She does not allow the reader to be indifferent towards her experiences, as her depiction of a person, a memory, or an emotional scene leave an unforgettable impression upon the reader. There is also a paradox. While the poet shares her emotions with the reader still has the feeling that he is furtively peeping into her innermost thoughts and feelings. This looms larger and larger in the reader's mind when one considers that she did not want to publish these poems. She wrote these poems for herself. In modern times, we would call it poetry therapy, writing poems as a way of processing pain and suffering. Poetry helps her to heal the pain, as Ghulam Hussein Yusufi said. Although the forced marriage has offered existential security, the subjectively felt security is missing. I repeat this line. Okay? Although the forced marriage has offered existential security, the subjectively felt security is missing here. We do not know whether she returned to her own poetry, read and reread the poems, not only to improve their qualities, but also to ponder on the contents, reflecting on a specific event, adding or removing lines. In one poem, she says that she burned her collected poetry. Why did she burn it? Did the poems contain even more family secrets or explicit references to her situation? We do not know. We know that she composed these poems on pieces of paper, and her son Pejman Bakhtiyari found them inside books in their private library. He collected and published them after her death. Part of it was before her death, but mostly after her death. While we should be grateful to Pejman Bakhtiyari, the sad conclusion is that her example could be regarded as the condition of a generation of women, of Persian women, in a warring situation. Writing poetry was a way to lessen her pain and agony. A difference between poetry and prose in the writing of personal experiences is that poetry enables one to create a space in order to universalize them, so that many people can make their own interpretations. Choosing to write her experiences in poetic form, she forces herself and the reader to go beyond the usual personal thinking, inviting the reader to pause, to reread, to examine the metaphors, imageries, and experiences. Zhale could be considered as one of the early modern female poets who used classical forms such as qasideh, ghazal, rubai for a new personal purpose. The classical ghazal, which is commonly used to proclaim the lover's unrequited love, is turned into a personal outburst of misery, social deprivation, and hopelessness. The impersonal ghazal has transformed itself into the personal song of an unhappy woman. It is this sad content in ancient form that has the utmost effect on the reader. The unfamiliar, the personal, is presented in a familiar form. Using a wide range of meters, creating specific rhythms, strengthened by rhyme, Zhale's poetry is very powerful. Even those poems which are impersonal have a rhythmic force. Despite the sorrow, frustration, and agony, Zhale's poetry has a tender side with a philosophical turn. Yusufi praises her poetry, including her in his personal poetic canon of 70 classical and modern Persian poets. He characterizes her poetry as an example of radiant genius, graceful, sensitive, and an astonishing art, while also emphasizing her power of imagination, intellectual vigor, and the innovative ways in which she has coined words and metaphors. Yusufi is right that Zhale chose to compose poetry as a refuge, and it is this fleeing and seeking shelter in art that probably enabled her to endure the pains inflicted upon her. She invokes a poetic space between herself and others. It is in this space that she defrosts her husband's icy house. Poetry removes the sharp edges of her existence, softening and making her life bearable. Thank you. I will leave it at this.